The grand halls of Grandma Nasira's mansion buzzed with excitement and tension. In Lumeka, a town known for its wealth and elegance, everyone knew that today's gathering wasn't just any family visit. It was the day the matriarch's will would finally be read. Guests arrived in glittering clothes, pearls, and tailored suits, their whispers echoing off the marble floors. Each relative had their eyes fixed on the prize, the fortune, the estates, and the businesses that had made Nasira a legend in town. Everyone hoped, or maybe schemed, to be the one to inherit it all. In a quiet corner, far from the laughter and polite chatter, sat Amira. She hugged herself, trying to disappear into the velvet of the sofa. Her stomach twisted every time her grandmother's sharp eyes landed on her. Nasira had never been kind to Amira. From the time she was a child, she had been told she was worthless, a disappointment, the one who will get nothing. Each insult had carved itself into her confidence, leaving her nervous and ashamed among the proud, boastful cousins. She watched them flirt with the lawyers, laugh over champagne, and exchange knowing glances, certain of their future windfall. Amira's heart pounded as the clock ticked closer to the announcement. She wondered how it would feel to be dismissed yet again, to have everyone's eyes on her while they whispered about her failure. But beneath the fear and humiliation, a tiny spark of determination flickered. She didn't yet know what lay ahead, but for the first time, she felt a strange sense that maybe, just maybe, this gathering could change everything. The room fell silent as the lawyer cleared his throat and began reading the will. Everyone leaned forward, eager for the first mention of their names. Amira's stomach knotted, her hands clutching each other tightly in her lap. She tried to shrink into herself, hoping the moment would pass quietly, but it never did with Grandma Nasira. When the lawyer reached her name, Nasira's smirk stretched across her face. "Amira," she said, her voice sharp enough to slice through the murmurs in the room. "You'll never inherit a dime from me." The words hung in the air, heavy and cruel, and a ripple of laughter spread through the family. Her cousins nudged each other, smirking as they whispered, "The forgotten granddaughter. She's always been useless." The label stung more than the words themselves. One by one, the lawyer read out the rest of the will. Cousins squealed in delight over estates in the city, summer homes by the lake, and jewelry that sparkled like sunlight. They bragged about businesses, stocks, and investments, imagining the lives of luxury they would now lead. Every time a name was read, the room erupted in applause, clinking glasses, and self-congratulations. Amira sat still, her heart sinking further. Finally, the lawyer handed her an envelope. It was small, plain, and unassuming. Everyone leaned forward to see it, curiosity mixed with scorn. "That's it?" one cousin whispered, snickering. "Surely it's just another insult," another added. Amira's hands trembled as she took the envelope, the paper crisp under her fingers. She could feel the weight of every pair of eyes on her, every mocking smile, every whisper filled with doubt and judgment. Her grandmother chuckled softly, savoring the moment. "That's all you'll ever get," Nasira said, leaning back in her chair. "Not a home, not a business, not even a jewel. Nothing." The words stung, but Amira forced herself to stay silent. Her face burned with shame as her cousins whispered behind their hands, trying not to laugh too loudly. And yet, in that moment, beneath the humiliation and the whispers, a tiny flicker of something different stirred inside her. She didn't know what it meant yet. All she knew was that the envelope in her hand was hers alone, and maybe, just maybe, it was more important than anyone could see. Amira's hands shook as she held the small envelope. Every eye in the room was on her, waiting for her reaction. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, and carefully tore it open. Inside, she found only a single key and a folded piece of paper. Her heart sank. A key? What could she possibly do with this? She unfolded the paper slowly, her fingers trembling, and glanced at the neat handwriting inside. It was from her late grandfather, Bashiru, though she didn't yet know what it meant. The room erupted into laughter. Cousins leaned back in their chairs, smirking and whispering. "Just a key? That's her inheritance?" What a joke. Some held their sides, unable to contain themselves, while others whispered cruel remarks, imagining all the ways they could humiliate her further. Amira's face burned with shame. She felt the weight of everyone's eyes, the sting of their laughter pressing down on her chest. Grandma Nasira's voice cut through the laughter like a knife. "That's all you'll ever deserve," she said, her tone full of satisfaction. She leaned back in her chair, eyes sparkling with triumph. Nothing more, never more. Amira's lips pressed together, but she didn't respond. She didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't cry out loud. Instead, she clutched the key tightly, feeling its cold metal against her palm. There was something strange about it, a weight, not just in the hand but in the heart, a hint that it might mean more than anyone realized. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Every cousin's laugh, every mocking whisper, felt like a hammer striking her pride. Yet beneath the humiliation, a quiet determination began to grow. The laughter, the taunts, the sneers, they all reminded her of how much she had been underestimated, how little anyone believed it. And maybe, just maybe, that key was the first sign that things could change. Amira stood slowly, holding the key and the folded paper to her chest. Her family continued to laugh and mock, but she didn't shrink back this time. A small spark of something strong flickered inside her, a feeling she hadn't had before. Shame was heavy, but hope was heavier. And as she looked at the room full of smug faces, she realized something she hadn't before. This key might be the beginning of her own story, one that no one else could write for her. That night, after the last echoes of laughter had faded from Grandma Nasira's mansion, Amira sat alone in her room. The envelope and the key lay on the table beside her, but her attention was fixed on the folded paper. She smoothed it out, feeling the texture of the paper, and studied the handwriting. It was careful, looping, familiar, the handwriting of her late grandfather, Bashiru. Her chest tightened as memories of him flooded back. His warm smile, his gentle voice, the way he had always believed in her even when everyone else didn't. Her eyes moved across the words, each sentence pulling her in. The note spoke directly to her, calling her "my dear Amira," and guiding her to a hidden property in Kalunda, a coastal town she had only visited once as a child. The letter was full of instructions, but it carried more than directions. It carried trust, love, and a promise that her grandfather had left something extraordinary for her alone. She traced the words with her finger, her heart pounding. Could it really be true? Could this key, this simple piece of metal, unlock something beyond the cruel jokes of her family? For hours, she read and reread the letter, making notes in the margins, imagining what might be waiting for her. She pictured the ocean breeze, the sound of waves crashing against the shore, and the possibility that her grandfather had left her a secret empire far beyond the reach of her greedy relative. Every detail made her more certain. She couldn't wait. She couldn't let fear or doubt hold her back. Finally, as the moonlight spilled into the room, she made her decision. Tomorrow, she would leave for Kalunda. She would follow the instructions, unlock whatever her grandfather had hidden, and find out for herself what he had left her. She felt a strange mix of fear and excitement. Her relatives would be celebrating their new wealth, drinking champagne, laughing over their inheritance, but she didn't care. She was about to embark on her own journey, one that was hers alone. Clutching the letter and the key tightly, Amira lay down but could hardly sleep. Thoughts of the hidden property kept running through her mind. She imagined the look on her family's faces if she returned with something greater than anything they had inherited. But more than that, she felt a quiet determination growing inside her. For the first time in a long while, she felt powerful, not because of what she had now, but because of what she was about to discover. By dawn, her decision was clear. She would go to Kalunda, unlock the mystery, and claim the inheritance her grandmother had refused to give her. The night had been long, but in the darkness, Amira had found something no one could take away: hope, courage, and the first spark of a plan that would change everything. Amira arrived in Kalunda as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The coastal air smelled of salt and freedom, and her heart raced with a mix of excitement and nervousness. She followed the directions from her grandfather's letter, winding along quiet streets until she reached a tall, iron gate, rusted at the edges but still solid. She held the key tightly in her hand, her fingers brushing over the cold metal, and took a deep breath before sliding it into the lock. The key turned smoothly, and the gate creaked open. Amira stepped inside and froze. Before her stood a massive villa, abandoned but majestic, with grand columns and wide windows that looked out over the sparkling ocean. The garden was overgrown, and the paint peeled in places, but it didn't matter. She felt a thrill she had never known before. This place, hidden away from everyone else, was hers to explore. Inside, the villa smelled of dust and old wood, a mixture of time and secrets. Amira walked carefully through the grand hallways, her footsteps echoing. In one room, she found safes tucked behind faded curtains. In another, cabinets full of documents, letters, and ledgers. She opened a drawer and her eyes widened. There it was, stacks of business titles, papers confirming ownership of companies, villas, and investments, all in her name. Every document, every piece of paper, was proof that her grandfather had built a secret empire just for her, hidden away from the greedy eyes of her family. Tears stung her eyes, but this time they weren't from shame. They were from awe and relief. She had been dismissed, laughed at, told she was worthless. But here was the truth her grandmother had tried to hide from everyone. Her grandfather had believed in her when no one else did. He had trusted her with something priceless. Amira ran her fingers over the documents, feeling the weight of what she held. She was no longer the forgotten granddaughter. She was the heir to a fortune far beyond anything her cousins had dreamed of. Every corner of the villa seemed to whisper its secrets to her. She opened more safes, discovering jewelry, antique coins, and rare artifacts. But it wasn't just the wealth that overwhelmed her. It was the knowledge that this had been her grandfather's gift, a silent message of love and trust. The villa, the documents, the keys to companies across Lumeka and beyond, they were all proof that her destiny had been waiting for her all along. Amira stood on the balcony, the ocean breeze in her hair, and looked out at the horizon. For the first time in her life, she felt a surge of power and possibility. This wasn't just inheritance. It was freedom, recognition, and a chance to prove to the world, and to herself, that she was worth everything she had ever been denied. Amira returned to Lumeka with a new sense of purpose. She wasn't the timid, overlooked granddaughter anymore. She was the rightful owner of her grandfather's secret empire, and she planned to claim it fully. The first thing she did was hire a team of skilled lawyers and accountants. She needed experts to navigate the maze of documents, business titles, and legal papers her grandfather had left behind. Every contract she signed, every signature she placed, felt like another step away from the humiliation she had endured and closer to the life she had always deserved. Over the next few months, Amira worked tirelessly. She restored neglected businesses, bringing back life to factories that had long been idle and reviving properties that had fallen into disrepair. She met with managers, studied reports, and made smart decisions, showing a talent and determination that surprised even the professionals around her. Slowly but surely, her empire began to thrive. The villa in Kalunda became a hub for her operations, a symbol of the fortune and trust her grandfather had placed in her. Meanwhile, news of her sudden rise spread through Lumeka like wildfire. Her cousins, who had once mocked her and celebrated their own inheritance, began to realize that Amira's wealth was growing faster than them. Some of them had already squandered their shares on frivolous luxuries, careless investments, and endless parties. They started running into trouble, debts piling up, creditors calling, and their once bright prospects dimming with each passing day. The very people who had laughed at her were now struggling, helpless to stop the shift of fortune. Amira didn't flaunt her wealth or gloat publicly. Instead, she carried herself with quiet confidence, letting her actions speak louder than words. People in Lumeka began to take notice. Whispers ran through the town. The forgotten granddaughter was no longer forgotten. She had not only reclaimed her grandfather's empire, but had turned it into something greater than anyone expected. Her reputation grew alongside her businesses, and respect replaced the pity and ridicule she had once endured. Through it all, Amira felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was more than money. It was proof that she was capable, intelligent, and resilient. The humiliation of the past, the cruel laughter at her grandmother's mansion, it no longer had power over her. She had taken control of her life and her inheritance, transforming it into a legacy she could be proud of. In a matter of months, the girl who had been dismissed as worthless had become the most powerful and respected figure in Lumeka, her rise a quiet, unstoppable force that left the greedy cousins scrambling to catch up. Amira's journey from the shadows to the top was complete. She had turned the tables on a family that had underestimated her, proving that determination, courage, and belief in oneself could change everything. And while her cousins struggled with their losses, Amira's empire continued to grow, stronger and more secure than ever. The next family gathering was filled with the usual chatter, laughter, and the soft clinking of glasses. Cousins boasted about their wealth again, showing off new purchases, designer clothes, and flashy gadgets, completely unaware that the forgotten granddaughter was about to make her entrance. The doors swung open, and a sleek black car pulled up. One after another, luxury vehicles arrived, their engines purring quietly like the announcement of something important. And then she stepped out. Amira appeared at the top of the driveway, every eye in the room snapping toward her. She was dressed in a gown of deep emerald silk that caught the light with every movement, her hair perfectly styled, and her presence commanding attention. She carried herself with a calm confidence that silenced whispers and forced stares. For the first time, the family saw her not as the timid, overlooked girl, but as someone powerful, elegant, and untouchable. Grandma Nasira, seated at the head of the gathering, went pale. Her eyes widened as she looked at Amira, disbelief and fear flickering across her face. Where did you get this wealth?" she asked, her voice trembling. For once, the words were not cruel. They were uncertain, almost desperate. Amira smiled, a calm, knowing smile that sent a ripple through the room. She raised the envelope she had once received, now worn at the edges from careful handling. "This," she said softly but clearly, "is the envelope you laughed at, the one you thought meant nothing." She let a pause hang in the air, letting everyone absorb her words. Then, with quiet authority, she continued, "It was the key to everything you once dreamed of. The fortune, the businesses, the empire, everything my grandfather built for me away from your group." The room fell silent. Cousins who had mocked her just months ago stared at her, their faces a mix of shock, embarrassment, and disbelief. They opened their mouths to speak, but no words came. Amira walked past them, her heels clicking against the polished floor, each step a statement. She had arrived, she was in control, and she was untouchable. Every detail of her transformation, the cars, the dress, the calm authority, was deliberate. She didn't shout or brag, but the power of her presence spoke louder than any words. For the first time, the family understood that their cruelty had never diminished her. Instead, it had been a stepping stone for something far greater. Amira's eyes met her grandmother's once more. Nasira's usual smug confidence had vanished, replaced by fear and a deep, unspoken regret. Amira simply nodded, a gentle but undeniable reminder that she had claimed what was rightfully. The envelope had been small, but its contents, her grandfather's love, foresight, and secret empire, had changed everything. The girl they had mocked was no longer invisible. She had returned not just wealthy, but unstoppable, and the family could only stare as the forgotten granddaughter became the center of a new reality they could no longer control. The room was tense, every eye fixed on the lawyer as he cleared his throat. He held a thick folder in his hands, the proof of what Amira had been quietly building while the rest of the family flaunted their small inheritances. By the terms of your grandfather's estate, he began, Amira now legally controls his entire hidden empire, factories across the city, villas by the coast, and international accounts. A stunned silence fell over the gathering. The words seemed to echo off the walls, louder than any laughter or whispers could ever be. Cousins who had once sneered at her, who had called her worthless, and mocked the envelope she had received, now stared at her in shock. Their eyes darted between the lawyer, Amira, and the documents in his hands, trying to process what they had just heard. Slowly, almost reluctantly, their heads began to lower. Shame replaced arrogance, and for the first time, they realized they had been completely wrong about her. Amira's gaze swept across the room. Her posture was calm, her expression steady. She didn't need to speak. The silence itself carried the weight of her triumph. Every detail of her empire was now hers. The factories that hummed with work, the villas that gleamed in the sun, the international accounts that made her richer than anyone in the room could imagine. The same relatives who had laughed at her earlier now felt the sting of their own greed and short-sightedness. Grandma Nasira, who had always controlled the room with her sharp tongue and haughty presence, suddenly looked small and vulnerable. Her face turned pale as the reality sank in. She clutched the arms of her chair, her usual confidence gone. The shock was too much. With a soft gasp and a shudder, she collapsed backward, fainting in the center of the room. Gasps filled the air as cousins rushed to her side, but even as they helped her, the truth of the situation was undeniable. Amira had surpassed them all, and there was no denying it. The lawyer continued calmly, going over the details for anyone who still had doubts. But most people didn't need him. They could see it in Amira's confident stance, in the quiet authority she carried, in the way the room seemed to shift around her. She wasn't just rich. She was untouchable, respected, and in complete control of her grandfather's legacy. For the first time in her life, Amira felt the full weight of triumph. The cousins who had mocked her, the grandmother who had scorned her, all realized that the forgotten granddaughter had become the most powerful person in the room. The empire that had once been hidden, the inheritance that had seemed so small in a simple envelope, had now silenced every voice that had ever doubted her. The table that had been filled with whispers and sneers was now quiet, and Amira stood at the center of it all, unstoppable and victorious. Grandma Nasira slowly opened her eyes, pale and trembling, still lying back in the chair where she had fainted. The room was quiet, but the tension was thick, like a storm that hadn't yet passed. She tried to lift her head, but the reality of her humiliation pressed down too heavily. The wealth, the empire, the power, all of it was now Amira's. Nasira couldn't face it. She looked around weakly, avoiding eye contact, as if the walls themselves were judging her. Meanwhile, the cousins were in chaos. The same people who had flaunted their inheritance and laughed at Amira were now panicked. Arguments broke out over who had wasted their money, who owed what, and who had been foolish enough to trust investments that had already gone sour. They turned to Amira, desperation written on their faces, hoping that the forgotten granddaughter might take pity on them, or perhaps offer a way out of their self-inflicted mess. "Please, Amira," one cousin begged, "can you help us?" "We didn't know," another chimed in, voice shaking. "We're in trouble, we need your advice, your money, anything." Amira looked at them calmly, her eyes steady and clear. She held the envelope from her grandfather, the key that had started it all, as if it were a symbol of the journey that had brought her here. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't scold them. She only said slowly, "You laughed when I had nothing. You called me worthless. You mocked the envelope my grandfather left me." Her words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. The cousins shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. "And now," Amira continued, a small, confident smile playing on her lips, "you'll watch me shine with everything." She let the silence stretch, letting them feel the full weight of her triumph. There was no anger in her tone, only quiet, undeniable strength. She had not sought revenge, but the natural consequence of their cruelty was undeniable. The tables had turned, and they could only watch as she stood tall, the heir to an empire they had ignored and ridiculed. The cousins lowered their heads, shame written in every line of their faces. They realized that their greed and arrogance had blinded them to what truly mattered, the quiet determination and intelligence of the girl they had dismissed. Amira didn't gloat or flaunt her power unnecessarily. Her calm authority spoke louder than any words could. Nasira remained seated, weak and humiliated, unable to even utter a word. The once proud matriarch had no answers, no defenses, no clever remarks. The power had shifted completely, and it was irreversible. Amira had risen not by chance, but by courage, determination, and the love her grandfather had placed in her hand. For the first time, her family saw her not as the forgotten granddaughter, but as a force they could not ignore. The laughter of the past had ended, replaced by a deep, quiet respect, one born from seeing the true strength of someone they had once underestimated. Amira never forgot the lessons of her past. Though she could have used her wealth to punish her family or flaunt her success, she chose a different path. She invested in Kalunda, building schools where children could learn, hospitals where the sick could heal, and community centers where people could gather and grow. Every project she undertook carried the spirit of her grandfather, Bashiru, whose love for her had been the key to this new life. Each brick laid, each classroom opened, felt like a tribute to him and a promise that his vision would live on. News of her generosity spread quickly through Lumeka. People whispered in astonishment. The granddaughter who had once been mocked, called worthless by her own grandmother, was now the owner of a vast empire and a force for good. The contrast between her past humiliation and her current influence made the story even more remarkable. Children she helped in Kalunda would grow up knowing the woman who had risen from laughter and scorn to become a symbol of hope and possibility. Amira's life became legendary not because she had gained wealth, but because she had used it wisely. The envelope that everyone had laughed at, the key that had seemed so small and insignificant, had carried the power to transform her entire world and the lives of countless others. Families in Lumeka talked about her story for years, teaching their children that sometimes the greatest strength comes from patience, courage, and believing in oneself even when the world doubts you. In the end, Amira's legacy was clear. She had turned cruelty and mockery into compassion and growth, proving that true power isn't in money alone, but in what you do with it. The forgotten granddaughter had not only reclaimed her inheritance, but had built a future far richer than anyone could have imagined.